Hi, everyone. This is Allegra Davis Hannah. I just want to make sure before we get started that you all know that the webinar is being recorded and it will be posted to our YouTube channel. So if for some reason you want to go back and rewatch it, you will be able to. You will also have plenty of time to ask questions. You can type them into the chat when you think of them. We may not get to answer questions until the end, but you're welcome to put questions in there at any time as they pop up or as you think of them. So welcome to our webinar. Today we are going to talk about language in politics, which is, of course, a very timely topic. I see that everyone is muted and has their cameras off, so I appreciate that. Your presenters today are me. I'm Allegra Davis Hannah. I teach English and I'm the department chair for humanities.
And I'm Angela Thurman. I teach economics and I'm the department chair for economics, the sciences, and kinesiology.
And I'm Misty Wilson Mertens. I am the chair for social sciences, and I'll be on the chat today.
All right, so we're going to get started. And the first thing we want to do is just talk about how most words have two meanings.
So denotation.
Yes.
What does denotation mean?
It's what you would find in the dictionary as the technical, objective definition of a term. So if you look up the word army, for instance, it would tell you that it's a group of soldiers usually fighting or assembled to protect a country, right? But that word also means different things to different people, and those are the connotations. So if you are a fan of the musical group BTS, that word has a different connotation for you because those fans call themselves an army. If your husband or your wife or your mother is in the army, that word has a different feeling or association. And those are connotative meanings. And so sometimes, most words have negative or positive associations, and generally those associations come from connotation. Sometimes it's cultural.
Right. So even I'm thinking, so sometimes my son will say something is sick. And if I looked it up, that would mean ill. But in for the slang, it means cool. So is that an example of denotation versus connotation?
Sort of. Slang can be tricky, but yes, it means something different based on cultural association. So what politicians and media outlets should do is use neutral or positive words to communicate. They should be aware that some words have particular connotations, and they should try to avoid words that intentionally stir up emotion. Unethical communicators, and that includes people who are trying to sell you something, persuade you to do something, sometimes do so unethically. They intentionally use words that have very strong connotations to get you to feel a certain way. So some examples, my dog might bark. If I mute myself, that's why. Some examples of words that have connotations, right? Heart. So if you look it up in the definition, it's an organ, it's in your body, it pumps blood, it's part of your circulatory system. But when I say you have heart, I'm not talking about your circulatory system. But also think about the word politician. So it is a neutral word, but I'm also aware that it has very, very strong connotations. So sometimes you can use it as an insult, right?
Right.
And if this is a tricky concept for you, think about these sets of words on the right-hand side that all have the same denotation, but they have very different connotations. So if I say that you're childish, or if I say that you're childlike, both mean that you remind me of a child, that some of your behaviors are reminiscent of what a child would do. But childish is an insult and childlike is kind of a compliment. And so I'm aware of that when I speak. And so when I choose my words, I can choose to say, you're very childlike, or I can say, you're very childish.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And if I tell my husband to just do a particular chore. He can say, I asked him. He can say, I reminded him. Or he can say, I nagged him. They all mean about the same thing, but they have different connotations.
Right. And also the way, for example, let's just take that example one step further. If you said to your husband, would you please empty the dishwasher? And he said to you, quit nagging me, that would invoke a different response from you than if he said, thank you for asking me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's not only the words that we use, but it's also the words that are used in response. So you could see how things could escalate very quickly if you and I continued to use words that had these negative connotations rather than how we could have a civil conversation if we both chose to use neutral words.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so an example of how people do this to mislead you sometimes is when they say things like, it's inexpensive. That makes it sound like you're saving money. But if I say it's cheap, that sounds like it's going to break, right? But those two words denotatively mean the same thing. And most people who are public speakers or even professors or politicians or writers in the media or journalists, they are very, very aware of words that have different connotations but have the same denotative meaning, which means that they are choosing their words very carefully to elicit or evoke particular responses among the audience. So if I want you to buy it, I will say it's inexpensive. If someone else is selling it and I don't want you to buy it, I'm going to say that is cheap. Right?
Yep.
And so house and home, right? When they're trying to sell me a house, they're going to tell me that they're selling me a home because they want me to buy it and they want me to feel at home. And of course I do. And those words have strong positive connotative.
+17202995895.
It's got to be one of my
Is now
favorite
joining.
features of Teams. Probably my favorite. Okay.
Yes.
So a euphemism, are you familiar with this word? Euphemism?
Go ahead and explain what a euphemism is.
So it's really saying something more politely or softening what you're saying. It's a mild or more indirect way of communicating something. Now, sometimes we do this to be polite, and sometimes we do this to be evasive. So if I say, for instance, we need a bio break in a meeting, I'm trying to be polite and not say I have to go to the bathroom, right?
Right.
If I say, someone passed away, I'm trying to be more sensitive and not use the harsher terms.
Right. Yeah, I say go all the time. That's what I say, and it really means I want to go, but I always say, well, I'm going to let you go now. So that is a polite way of saying I don't want to talk to you anymore.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to let you go, or I'll let you get back to what you're doing instead of I'm going to go. But also, be aware of how these terms are used by people in positions of power. So when we say that a certain number of military members lost their lives, that is a polite way of saying they were killed, right? And so they're trying to soften what happened. Enhanced interrogation is a nicer, more polite way of saying painfully interrogated. Some might even use the word torture, right? Correctional facility is a jail. Friendly fire means, something a lot more vicious than the words friendly fire.
But don't you think in some ways that is almost, I don't know, kind of whitewashing things?
Yes.
To say if somebody, that guy or that girl, they broke the law and they went to jail. That is what happened. And to say, well, they did something that was not quite right, and so now they're in a correctional facility. That is almost evasive to the point that I'm going, what?
Mhm.
So sometimes
And the term correctional facility makes everybody feel more comfortable with the fact that we are putting people in prison, right?
Right.
So if I call it a correctional facility, it sounds like I'm doing something to help them,
Right.
as opposed to putting them in a jail. But also, it's just more kind of easy to discuss. And the same, like if we're talking about gambling, and if we are in favor of gambling, or if we want to pass a measure that would allow gambling, we call it gaming.
Yeah.
But if we don't like it, we call it gambling, right? And
Yeah.
so you can use these euphemisms to kind of persuade people the same way used car dealers call all those cars pre-owned. That is the
True.
silliest euphemism to me. And a lot of people are familiar with the term euphemism because it's words that they put in place of words that might be scandalous, but it has a meaning in political speech as well. And I think I have some examples of how newspapers sometimes use euphemisms. This one is that a police officer discharged a weapon and striking suspect, which is the most roundabout way of saying that they shot someone, right?
Right.
And so these are highlighting some ways that newspapers soften things that happen so as not to seem like they're pointing the finger at someone.
So would you tie this in with being politically correct?
That's a whole different issue, but sometimes they're related. Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
So this is kind of the opposite.
Loaded language. All right. So we already talked about denotative and connotative. So now you're saying we're going to be using the connotative part to influence my listener, right?
Yes. So I know that particular words will get a particular response from my audience. And so sometimes I will use these words that seem neutral but are loaded because they have connotative meanings. And in a minute, we'll talk about extreme examples of this, but these are the most kind of common examples. So these are all words that are used commonly in political speech. Cultural elite, right, is a way of othering people like college professors, by the way. Thug. If I don't agree with a particular governmental administration, I might refer to it as a regime, which technically that's what it means, but that sounds very militaristic.
Yeah.
Gun control is often used to elicit a strong response, but people who are in favor of gun law reform would probably not call it gun control, right? The word feminist is loaded. If I use that word, I am aware that it has strong connotative meanings. And we're going to talk about the word riot a little bit more later, but family values, mainstream media. I'm going to say I'm using these words for their denotative meaning, but I'm very aware as a politician of their connotative meaning. So I'm very aware that my audience hears what I'm trying to say when I use loaded words. And if I'm not aware of it, if I'm doing it on accident, then I mean, that's very rare. But sometimes people use the word gun control without realizing how loaded it is. Or sometimes people think feminist isn't as loaded as it is. But these are all very loaded terms. And they know that in listeners' mind, they're going to have a very strong reactive response. And that's what they're going for.
Well, just the term loaded, another way I've heard these types of things described, they're triggers. So and loaded trigger, I mean, basically you're going to use these words to get the response that you want. And if I am attuned to you, then I'm going to respond to that. Like you said, some people wouldn't. I mean, you might say something like new age. If I'm not attuned to that, then I'm not going to give you the result you want. But you are counting on the people that you're trying to reach agreeing with you by using these loaded trigger words, correct?
Correct. And here's an example of, and you're leading me into my next topic very well. So if I just have these very strong words that my audience is aware of what I mean, but I'm not actually saying anything necessarily negative, right? But words like war on American life is meant to be loaded. It's meant to be charged. It's meant to give you a very strong emotional response. And in an extreme example of that is what in political speak is referred to as a dog whistle. Now, if you are familiar with training dogs, then you know what a dog whistle is, right? It's a whistle that I blow, that only my dog can hear, that no one else in the room can hear, right?
Right.
So that is a coded language that is used to get support. It is used to telegraph a message to people who agree with me, while creating deniability and saying I didn't say anything bad. Okay. So I'm trying to signal my supporters or people who agree with me, just like a dog whistle. I'm trying to signal my dog without letting anybody else really know, or without giving away exactly what I'm saying. So these are super highly suggestive, very loaded terms that have very strong reactions with some people, but I can say, I get plausible deniability and say, I just said this very basic word, right? The best example of this is when people talk about the former president and they emphasize his middle name. So if I say Barack Obama, right, I'm talking about the president. If I say Barack Hussein Obama, I have this plausible deniability. All I said was the man's name, but everybody who agrees with me understands that I'm emphasizing his middle name to make him sound foreign, to make him sound different, to even perhaps associate him with Saddam Hussein in some way. And so I'm sending this coded message, but I'm giving myself deniability. So I can say, I didn't say anything wrong. I just said his name. But everybody knows it if they're really paying attention. Urban is another phrase that is often used as a dog whistle. When people say urban, they're often referring to people who live in predominantly African American or Latino neighborhoods. That's what they mean, right? And I mean, when I lived in Fort Worth, I lived in an urban city, but when people talked about urban cities, they weren't really talking about where I lived or me specifically, right? It's a code word for talking about neighborhoods that are predominantly people of color. So this is kind of an exaggerated version of loaded language, and it's coded language, which rhymes. So here's some examples. So same with urban, when we talk about inner city, preying on the suburbs, this is a code for saying people of color were going into predominantly white neighborhoods. That's just a code. And if you're looking for it, if you're aware of it, then you know it. And that's from 1981. That headline is older than me. And that's important. I took a long time to look for that because I don't want anyone to think that this is brand new. These are not new tactics. These are very old tactics. Misty can tell us. Misty can probably give us examples from the 1700s.
Well, they keep using it because it works. It gets the response that they want. So
exactly, it works. No questions yet. Okay. I'm sorry, my dogs are going insane.
That's okay. It must be the dog whistle.
So I want to talk about an example of the importance of language in politics. And it's the same as the importance of language when you're trying to sell something. So there's a tax on your property when you die that your inheritance have to pay. Okay. You don't have to read all of this because I copied this from the IRS website, which means it's supposed to be very boring and dry. Okay. That's called the estate tax. All right. It's a tax on your right to transfer property at your death. Okay. Most people, when they die and transfer their estates, don't have to pay this. In 2004, the amount you had to make $1.5 million in order to have to pay this tax. Now you have to make $11.5 million to pay this tax. Okay. So correct me if I'm wrong, Angie, because I know you teach economics, but
Yes.
this is a tax that really is for super wealthy people. For when they die and when people inherit their property, they have to pay taxes on what they inherited. If
Okay.
it's over $11 million.
That is true.
Okay.
But I would like to point out that as an economist, all of this has already been taxed. So that is important for people to realize, because we're going to be going through here talking about the way it's presented. So it's easy to say, well, those people are super rich, so they should pay that tax. But I would like to point out, everything in the estate has already been taxed. So this is double taxation for their heirs. So the person that is dead is obviously not paying the tax. The tax will come out of their estate before their heirs or the people that will inherit the money get it. So that is the clarification. So now move on.
So some people don't like this estate tax because it's double taxation, or because they stand to inherit a lot of money and they don't want to have to pay a 40% tax rate on it, right? So if, for instance, my parents had $11.5 million, let's imagine, right? They would have been paying income taxes on $11.5 million when they earned it. Then they die. They give me the $11.5 million, but really I only get $8 million because I had to pay this tax rate, okay? So again, this is something that 15 years ago was much lower income rate, $1.5 million, but we have raised it over time. And one way that we got that number hiked way up is because people started calling it a death tax. And when we say it's a death tax, it makes it sound like we pay taxes to die, which everyone out of hand would say that's outrageous, right? It's ridiculous. Why did you have to pay taxes to die? So it makes it sound worse or different than what it is. It gives it's accurate, right? It is taxes paid upon someone's death, so it's not a lie. It is accurate. But I know that saying a death tax is going to elicit a lot of connotative meanings from people, right? The word tax already has got a negative connotation with almost everyone, right? Nobody likes to pay taxes necessarily.
Right.
But the term death tax makes it sound worse or different than what it necessarily is. Because again, this is not something most people would ever have to pay.
That is true.
So this political cartoon is an exaggeration of that, because this person's t-shirt says I paid taxes all my life and all I got was this lousy t-shirt. First of all, this makes it sound like the dead person is paying the taxes, and that's not necessarily true. But this doesn't look like a person who has $11.5 million, although appearances can always be deceiving.
So let me ask you about this. So cartoons seem very entertaining and harmless.
Mm-hmm.
So are you telling me that this cartoon is actually giving me the message, and the message is, hey, that guy is just like me, kind of. I mean, he's like old Farmer Brown. I can relate to him.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm looking at this cartoon going, wait, that guy is paying estate taxes? Because if he's paying estate taxes, then I probably am too.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're telling me that this simple little cartoon could potentially evoke a response one way or another.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So you're saying that this is not just entertaining, right? This is passing a message on that
the most.
Go ahead.
I was just say political political advertising. They're very loaded when they're political cartoons. All of the imagery is on purpose. I mean, it's the Grim Reaper.
Right. Well, this is a dog whistle in and of itself, is it not?
Well, it's very loaded. And you're right that the way he's dressed makes it seem like he's kind of average Joe, and average Joe is not going to pay the estate tax, but this makes it seem more threatening than it is. So if we call it an estate tax, most people don't think of their property or their bank accounts as being their estates, right? So if it says, if it's called an estate tax, to me, that sounds like something rich people have to deal with. I don't care about it. If you call it a death tax, that sounds like you're going to charge me to die. I don't like that. But and that is how we have raised the income rate that is charged the estate tax, again, from $1.5 million to $11.5 million, because we've changed, because the particular political parties have been able to message it as a death tax. So fewer and fewer people want to pay it, more and more people are against it, and the higher the rate of income that gets taxed, the fewer people have to pay that, right? There are fewer people making $11 million than there are with $1 million. True. And to be honest, a lot of people have $1 million by the time they retire. So we have made it even higher rates of income. And even though the IRS code calls it the estate tax, when politicians discuss it, they call it a death tax if they want you to be against it. And they call it a silver spoon tax if they want you to be for it. Because if I call it a silver spoon tax, that sounds even more like it has to do with elite, wealthy, select individuals, right? And so a lot of people would be in favor of charging the ultra wealthy if that's what they perceive the taxes for.
Yes, this is interesting for a couple of reasons. But I posted something for my economics classes similar to this, and it was basically what you're saying. The example that I used in my class just yesterday was the jobs report, which is basic information. It's simply statistics on the unemployment rate. But I posted two different reactions, and it is important to know that the media can take the exact same information, just like what you're saying here, and the way it's presented skews it so that you read that and you either go, wow, the unemployment rate is going down, that's great, or you go, it looks like a lot of people are still unemployed. And that's exactly what you're doing here. You're saying either we're saying this is a tax on the ultra rich who have, if you've got $11 million, you certainly could pay some of that in taxes. Or the other way is, man, you never get away from Uncle Sam. He's always taxing you, even when you're dead. So it is important to see what they are, how words are trying to manipulate you into thinking one way or another. So I think that this is very important, especially now.
Yeah. So sometimes there are words that it depends on the context and it depends on the tone in which they're said. And so all these words on the left, in the left-hand column, are words that mean something different depending on who's saying them, when they're said, and in what tone. So a lot of times you hear the word bureaucrat and it's a neutral word. It just means a person who works for the government. Right. So people who work at the IRS are bureaucrats. People who work at Homeland Security are bureaucrats, technically speaking. But there's a connotative meaning that I can draw out if I say it in a specific way or in a specific context. And so if I say, all these bureaucrats want you to believe, right, then I'm making it sound like they're people who are just mired in the political and governmental system, who are stuck in their ways and aren't interested in new ideas. Okay. The same is true of Obamacare, right? So I could say, I got my insurance through Obamacare, right? I could say a neutral sentence like that. But if it's in a political speech, I can use it as almost a slur against the Affordable Care Act, right?
Right.
It's called the Affordable Care Act, but people still call it Obamacare. And so it depends on your associations with the word, with the name, is how you feel about it. Social justice is objectively a good thing, right? We're talking about equality, we're talking about justice for people. But if I use the term social justice in the context of a social justice warrior, right, and I just talk about people who rage against things on Twitter and don't really do anything about it, then it's negative.
Right.
And when we talk about the swamp in Washington, I'm pretty sure whichever party you belong to, you're referring to members of the other party, right?
Right.
You're never going to say that person that person I just voted for is part of the swamp. Probably not, right?
Right.
And if, depending on your political affiliations or your views about immigration, you might think that dreamers is a positive term, and we're referring to people who are in this country working hard to achieve their dreams. Or you can use that word to be an insult about people who you believe are not in the country fairly. And the word justice itself, everybody's in favor of justice, but we all define that differently, and we all have different priorities about what that means. So we can talk about law and order and justice, and showing our preferential treatment toward police officers, or we can talk about justice and Black Lives Matter, right? We're both talking about justice, but we're talking about different things.
Right.
So you have to listen for the tone and the context to see what those words, how those words are being used and which way those words are being coded. And some words are just pretty clear, right? Even though these are, in some ways, objectively not offensive terms, they're almost always used in offensive ways. Anchor babies, calling people illegals, calling people gun nuts. If I think someone is kind of a hippie, I might call them granola. I can call you a right winger or a left winger, which just means Republican or Democrat, but it makes you sound kind of crazy.
Right.
Same with the term libs, right, instead of liberals. And so these are all words that we use to very easily dismiss people with whom we don't agree. If I'm in favor of changing gun laws, you would say I'm one of those gun control freaks, and I would say you're a gun nut, right? And so if I use those terms, I can dismiss the other person and ignore everything they have to say. Because you're not just a fellow human American who disagrees with me, you're a gun nut. And I don't have to listen to anything that you have to say. Or if I am very interested in things that you think are really hippie, right? You can say she's one of those granola eating hippies, and you don't have to listen to me anymore. You can dismiss me out of hand. And when we refer to members of or people aligned with different political parties as right wingers or left wingers, it's a way to dismiss everything they're saying as being cuckoo.
Right.
And
yeah, and you know, if we were to do that, and I think we see this a lot in social media, if I say I vote for this or I vote for that, or I believe in this or I believe in that, for you, for example, just to take that one thing and immediately go, you know, you are a tree hugger. I hate everything about you, and there's no possible way that we could agree on anything because you are that granola tree hugging person. Rather than, wouldn't it be lovely if you asked for a little clarification and you said, so you really love the outdoors, you're really in favor of you know, of protecting our parklands or whatever, tell me about that. And we may find that we have some common ground. But if we just immediately, I say, you're a left winger or you're a right winger, and boom, I'm, you know, defriending you. There's no way that I could ever have common ground with you.
Mm-hmm.
That is just increasing that divide, and making everything be black and white when really there's so much gray that we could share, right?
And yes, and we use those words as signals to dismiss each other.
Right.
And Misty has presented in previous webinars, right? Americans tend to agree on a lot of things for the most part, right? We want to protect the environment. We all like having a national park system. We all care about the safety of each other. Most people are in favor of changing some gun laws in reasonable, moderate ways, but we can dismiss each other with this terminology, and then we don't have to investigate our feelings any further. So I have some more sets of words.
Yeah, and not only that, but if you are going to, if you're going to basically call me a name or something, it shuts my mind against you. I'm
exactly.
Yeah, I'll say, well, Allegra thinks I am like this. Allegra thinks I'm a fanatic. I don't want to talk to Allegra anymore because I don't like her now. She makes me feel bad. If you would have said, Angie, you seem pretty dedicated to that would have opened up the conversation.
Exactly. So sometimes there are phrases that politicians use that actually mean nothing. They sound like they mean something, but they don't actually mean anything. So if a person, this is true all the time, if a person says, I'm sorry, but the word but negates the I'm sorry.
I tell that to my husband all the time.
I also want to point out that if you say, I'm sorry, you, blah, 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 you're also not apologizing.
True.
If we can easily refer to each other as being out of touch, that doesn't mean anything. It makes it sound like you don't understand something, or that you're an elitist, or that you've been in government too long, but that has no actual meaning. There's no way for me to specifically say, here is why or where you're out of touch, because we all have different priorities.
Right.
Everybody's
insulting.
Right. And everybody's going to say they want to lower taxes and that the other people want to raise taxes, but almost never do people lower or raise taxes for everyone at the same time. So I might run on a platform of lowering taxes, and you might all be, everybody is interested in someone who says, I'm going to lower taxes, but that doesn't mean I'm going to lower your taxes. And if I'm running against someone, I'm going to say he wants to raise taxes, but that doesn't mean he wants to raise your taxes, right? Not to mention that there are lots of ways that a person can raise taxes, but still you end up paying less because of other changes, right? These are just signals that don't mean anything, that are trying to elicit a very immediate reaction, right? Like no raising taxes, yes, lowering taxes. The word fascist does have a meaning, and there are like 2 history professors in here right now. I don't want you to think I'm saying fascist doesn't have a meaning, but I can say it about you, and you can say it about me, right? And so at that point, when politicians start using the word fascist back and forth, it doesn't really mean anything. It means that you have different priorities than me, and you want to control things in a different way, but it's not meaningful in political discourse. Neither is the word realistic. I say, oh, that's not realistic. That's not realistic. Right. And so these are just ways that I can signal to people without actually having to back up my claims. Right. I don't need evidence to say that you're out of touch. I can just say it about you, and then people will just think that about you.
True. Well, and then the other implication is if you say I'm out of touch, the implication is that you are in touch and you have special knowledge that somehow I don't have. So that pretty much just throws me out of the conversation. Oh, we're not going to talk to her. She's completely out of touch.
And
So,
what's important to look for is any claim should be supported by evidence. So there are people who are very reminiscent of fascist dictators, and I can support that with evidence. But if I don't, if I just say, "Oh, Angie's a fascist," right? It's just a insult, and it's a
right.
kind of a coded message, but without support to explain why she's out of touch or in what specific way we would lower taxes or raise taxes or change how much your bottom line is, then these are just words that don't mean anything, that get lobbed back and forth. And you can tell that politicians try to affect the way we hear and understand words, because it depends on if I agree with you, whether I think you're dedicated to a cause or whether I think you're a fanatic or a fundamentalist, right? If
Right.
I have a new approach to healthcare, I would call it an approach. You might call it a gimmick.
I see that.
I can say, I'm just explaining it. I'm not justifying it. Or you can say, she was justifying her actions, and justify has this negative connotation.
Right.
If you made a mistake, I can say you're misguided, or I can say you're evil. And the last set of words, you might think those are all neutral words, but if I want to make a person seem innocent or like they're a victim of something, I would call them a young man or a girl or a boy or a child. And so sometimes this becomes a gray area when someone's between 16 and 19, right? And if I want to make them sound like they're the perpetrator or they're dangerous, I might call them a man or a woman instead of a girl or a boy. And those words, again, are coded. So if I say he was a young man, if I say he was a boy, then it sounds like he's innocent or less dangerous.
Right.
And so you have to be very, very careful, because sometimes there are people who are accused of crimes and headlines or politicians call them men, and they're 15 years old, right? Those are kids. 15-year-olds are kids. So it depends on if I'm with you or against you, what kinds of words I'm going to use. And those are not neutral words. Even though those seem like relatively neutral words, they're not.
Right.
And this seems like something only English teachers would care about, except people are using these words to change our opinions, change our behavior, and impact how we vote, which means we all have to be very attuned to the way language is being used.
Right, right. I mean, it is amazing how words can manipulate people.
And, spin is a different thing, and we're not going to get too far into spin, but spin is something happened, and it's just like what you were talking about with the jobs report, right? Something happens, and the way I say it, the way I phrase it, the way I spin it makes it sound more dangerous, less dangerous, makes me sound more capable, or makes you sound less capable. And it's all the same information. And so that's why it's very important to get to the facts and not the packaging, right? So I can say that you're a fanatic, I can say that you're a gun nut, but what are the facts? Where is the information? Let me make my own conclusions about who's a nut and who's not, right? And so there are lots of organizations that are absolutely dedicated to a non-political, unbiased approach to understanding actual information. And when we're not sure about someone or something, we should rely on those organizations to get information that we can make our own conclusions. Because the fact is, politicians have drawn conclusions and they're trying to convince you that they're right. But if you look at the information, you can draw your own conclusions, and you can decide what your priorities are, what aligns with your values, what would impact your personal life, what you think is right or wrong, but you have to look at the actual information before you can draw your own conclusions.
So are you telling me that all of those celebrities that I follow on Instagram, all the stuff they tell me, I should not believe?
You should. I mean, some celebrities do a lot of fact checking too. It's not that they're wrong. It's just that you can't be sure that you are getting the entire picture. And that if someone is giving you their conclusions, that means that they have a set of information or data or facts or circumstances, and they've drawn a conclusion. So you need to do the same thing. Go to the information, get all of the data, and then draw your own conclusion.
Right. And I'm always telling my students this, not to be a cynic, but I always say, what's in it for that person? Why would they be saying this? And the fact is that a lot of people are paid for their so-called opinions.
Mm-hmm.
So don't be a sheeple. Make your own decisions. Don't just follow the crowd. And my students, if they're on here, they're going to go, yeah, we've heard that before. But it is very important to make your own mind up, get your own facts. And if you then agree with somebody, that's great. But don't just agree with them because they're your favorite musician, or they are, in a movie that you like, or whatever. Make your own decisions.
So before we get to our exercise in patriotism, words should matter. Words should convey objective meaning as much as possible. And what we call things and how we phrase things is very important. And so there is an objective definition provided by the FBI on what constitutes terrorism and what makes someone a terrorist. But that word is used selectively, right? So
Right.
Sometimes it should be used according to the FBI's definition, but isn't used by politicians. And sometimes the reverse is true. Sometimes a person isn't committing an act of terrorism, but is called a terrorist as a way of making them seem even more egregious. The phrase war on terror, right?
Right.
Doesn't have an objective meaning, but it has very strong associations. When our president initiated a travel ban, a lot of people called it a Muslim ban. Those have two very different meanings, but they refer to the same thing. It's based on who you're listening to and what you believe and where you align your values and what you're prioritizing. And the line between protest and riot, there is no line, right? It's you decide. When does a protest become a riot? We all agree riots sound bad. Protests sound good for the most part, right? It's a part of civic engagement. So if I want to discredit someone for protesting, I'll say they're rioting. But if I want to defend people who are rioting, I'll say they're protesting. So you need the information, and you need to decide for yourself what those words mean to you before you can agree or disagree.
Right.
And sometimes it doesn't matter what you call it. You just have to look at what's being done and what for. So I want to have an exercise, a mental exercise. You don't have to type your answers in the chat, although you can if you want. Which of these do you think is the definition of the word patriotism? And I'll tell you there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. These are all definitions that have been used to define the word patriotism.
So it
but
could
they're
be
all a little different.
But I could say, I definitely agree in A. I agree in C. I agree in D. So it's you can have more than one, correct?
Absolutely. So national pride or attachment to I like being an American. I'm proud to be an American. That's patriotism to some people. A sense that your nation shouldn't be criticized, right? We're special, we're important. You shouldn't criticize us. We should have positive feelings about it. You have a very special concern for your country's continual improvement and the well-being of people, or you have a sense of duty to contribute to your country and your country's safety and its welfare and its status. I will tell you that the belief that your country is better than all others sounds extreme, but it is some people's definition of patriotism, right? You hear that all the time. America is the greatest country in the world. So some people think that that is patriotism. And I will say that the answer B is probably the B and E are probably the most debatable, right? Those are the ones where people wouldn't necessarily agree. But I think we all probably have a special concern for the well-being of our country, probably. I don't know. But these are all very different meanings, and yet they're all meanings that can be attributed to the word patriotism. And as you see from the chat, or as you see in your mind, you are picking and choosing different ones. And I'm not going to tell you which ones are mine. But here's an even more challenging question. What does it mean to be patriotic? Which of these actions is patriotic? And if you really want to challenge, which one is the most patriotic? So we have displaying flags and celebrating holidays and buying lots of decor that's red, white, and blue. We have paying taxes, voting or somehow participating in the electoral process, working in a civilian service job, so a government job that's not the military, serving in the military, public service job like teaching or working for a nonprofit or being a first responder, or donating or volunteering for public service groups like Boys and Girls Club or food banks. So are all of those patriotic? Are some? Are none?
Well, one thing that I think is important is that I can't tell you that if you feel like A, B, and G are patriotic, I can't really judge your patriotism. I can't say, well, you know what? I wear an American flag swimsuit, and I've got the flags, and I pay taxes, and I vote, and I work at the post office, and my dad was in the military, so therefore I am a better American than you are. And I think that a lot of people do that, and me tearing you down doesn't make me a better American, does it?
No, it doesn't. And it's okay if you think that military service is or isn't more patriotic than working elsewhere in the government. My mom retired from the Department of Homeland Security, so I'm going to say I think D's patriotic. My husband's retired from the Air Force. I'm going to say I think E's patriotic. I vote, I pay taxes, I work in a public service job, I donate or volunteer for public service groups, and absolutely have a flag. So what if I think it's all of them? But then the question, what's the most? Does it matter what's the most? I mean, these things mean different. This word means something different to different people because of your experiences, because of your personal background, because of where you're from, right? We tend to have strong patriotic feelings more so in Texas than necessarily in other parts of the country. Like, this word is very loaded in terms of having a strong connotative meaning. But the other thing is, you're more likely to say a person's patriotic if you agree with them. So whoever you're planning to vote for in the election, you're going to say that person is more patriotic than the other person.
Yeah.
Based on...
It's interesting that you brought up Texas, because I think a lot of people also have those connotations about certain states. Somebody may say California is full of, they're just a bunch of wackos out there. Or, if you're from this state, then you're going to be very fill in the blank. So that's even another way that we have of dividing ourselves instead of bringing ourselves together.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of who you're voting for, regardless of I'll leave that back on the screen because I think some people were still typing in their answers. Regardless of who you're voting for, the last day to register to vote was yesterday. So if you are not registered to vote, it is too late, but you may be registered to vote and have forgotten. So if you look up, just Google, can I vote? It will take you to the right place. But early voting is October 13th through 30th. So it starts in just about a week. And election day is November 3rd. I will tell you, if you're voting in person, please try to not wait for election day. You're going to be in longer lines. You're going to be exposed to other people for a longer period of time. And the other thing is, there are some people who can't vote early. And so we just reserve the election day lines for those people who vote on election day. It's also easier to vote early because you can go anywhere in the county. You don't have to go to your actual precinct. Regardless, I'm sure you've heard about 27,000 times that it's very important that you vote if you can. If your vote wasn't important, so many people wouldn't be trying to compete for it. So it's very, very important.
Great point.
Misty is going to post a link in the chat that will take you to the survey for credit. If you're watching a recorded version of this on YouTube and you're watching it before October 8th at 2 p.m., then you can find the link to that survey in the comments or the video description. We have 2 more webinars this semester, and one in a few weeks is on Texas as a swing state. And that is becoming more of a question every day. And then we have a webinar after the election so we can kind of make sense of what happened. It's possible by November 17th that we won't know the outcome of the election yet. So we'll see what happens with those webinars, but we will have them and they will be on those topics, and we will try to make them as timely as possible. I'm forgetting something. Your faculty or your teacher may give you extra credit or credit for filling out the survey. So just make sure you include their name when you fill that out. Misty, did I forget anything?
No, that's it.
All right, great. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm going to stop the recording, but if you have any last minute questions, I will hang out and answer them.